over $1.5 million, gone, stolen without a single weapon, without a single bank robbery, without even stepping outside an apartment in Chicago. The woman behind it wasn't a government spy, wasn't a tech billionaire, wasn't anyone who appeared on a single radar screen until it was far too late. And the system she exploited, the one every major corporation in America trusted completely, had been hiding a weakness that nobody thought to look for. They called her Kyrie. This is not a theory. This is not reconstructed from rumor. Everything you are about to hear is documented in federal court records, in a formal United States Department of Justice publication, and in a Chicago Tribune report filed the day her grand jury indictment came down in 1989. The facts are on the record. What they reveal is a story that should have been impossible. The real question, the one that kept investigators awake, was not just what she did. It was how long she had been doing it before anyone noticed at all. Start with what you think you know about hackers. The image most people carry is specific. Teenagers, basements, glowing monitors, somebody in a hoodie trying to break into a government database. That image was already a cliché by the late 1980s, and it was exactly the kind of assumption that made Leslie Lynne Doucette so dangerous. She didn't fit the image, not even slightly. She was a Canadian citizen in her mid-30s, living in a rented apartment on North Ashland Avenue in Chicago. No corporate title, no engineering background that anyone was watching, no public presence of any kind. To the outside world, she was invisible in the most ordinary way. Just another person in a city of millions, living a life that gave no indication of what she was actually running. But in the underground, the story was completely different. In the digital subculture of the late 1980s, the bulletin boards, the phone-freaking networks, the shadow communities that existed in the spaces between telephone lines, she was known as Kyrie. Sometimes she used another name, long-distance information. Both names were chosen carefully. Both were a kind of advertisement, a signal to the people who moved through those underground spaces that she had something to offer: access, codes, the keys to systems that the corporations paying for them believed were locked tight. What she had figured out, what nobody in that world had organized at this scale before, was sitting inside a technology that every major American company had just spent a fortune installing and learning to trust completely. Picture a corporate office in 1988. The fax machine is humming. Someone is updating a spreadsheet on a desktop computer that costs more than a used car. And somewhere near the front desk, attached to a telephone line and an 800 number, is a machine that the company's leadership considers genuinely cutting edge, a voicemail computer. By the late 1980s, voicemail was transforming how American business communicated. The industry was worth $800 million a year, growing at 40% annually. The three dominant companies, AT&T, Octel, and Roam, were selling these systems to corporations across the country as fast as they could be installed. The pitch was simple: no more missed calls, no more pink message slips piling up on someone's desk. Employees could call in from anywhere, punch in a numeric password, and retrieve their messages. Managers could leave instructions. Entire offices could coordinate through a single system. It was efficient, it was modern, and every corporation that installed one believed it was protected. The security was the password. That was it. A numeric code assigned by the system administrator that stood between the outside world and everything stored inside the machine. The assumption, never really examined, never seriously stress tested, was that the password was enough. That assumption had a problem built directly into it, and Leslie saw it before almost anyone else did. Here is what the corporations hadn't fully reckoned with. A voicemail computer is, At its core, just a computer, and a computer protected only by a numeric password, especially one chosen by an administrator who prioritized convenience over complexity, is vulnerable to something that requires no genius whatsoever. You run a program against it. The program tries password after password, thousands of combinations, faster than any human could manage manually, and eventually the password falls. When it does, you are not inside one mailbox. You are inside the entire system. Every mailbox, every stored message, every function the machine was designed to perform. The administrator's access becomes your access. The corporation's infrastructure becomes your infrastructure. Most people, finding themselves in that position, would look around and then look for something to steal. Leslie looked around and saw something to build. This is the part of the story that changes how you understand everything that follows. Because what Leslie Lynne Doucette realized was that a compromised voicemail computer didn't have to be looted. It could be repurposed, transformed into something its designers had never intended, and its owners would never see coming. A corporate voicemail system running on a company's telephone line attached to an 800 number that anyone in the country could call for free. That was not just a compromised machine. That was a private communications network, a dead drop, an invisible bulletin board, operating inside infrastructure that the company had already paid for, already trusted, and was actively maintaining on her behalf without knowing it. She started using them to distribute things the underground desperately wanted: stolen credit card numbers, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Discover, calling card codes from AT&T, MCI, Sprint, and ITT that could be used to make free telephone calls anywhere in the world. And the most valuable commodity of all, something called PBX extender codes. A PBX system is a private telephone network that lives inside a company. It handles internal calls, routes extensions, manages communications within the building. Some of those systems came equipped with an extender feature, a line that allowed employees traveling for business to call in from outside, punch in a code, and place long-distance calls billed directly to the company. It was a convenience feature, a legitimate tool, designed for salespeople on the road, executives in hotel rooms, workers who needed to reach clients from across the country. What it was not designed for was this: a stranger anywhere in America calling that same line, punching in a stolen code, and making unlimited long-distance calls charged entirely to a company that had no idea its telephone system had just become someone else's personal resource. The company would get the bill at the end of the month. By then, the calls were already made, the codes were already circulating, and the woman who had distributed them was already on to the next compromised system. But even that wasn't the full picture of what she had built. The number that stopped investigators cold when they finally started adding it all up was not the credit card fraud. It was not even the calling card theft. It was the PBX extender codes. Over $1,291,000 in long-distance telephone service, stolen through codes distributed through compromised voicemail systems to people who had never set foot inside the companies paying for those calls. By the time federal agents in Chicago began seriously looking at the traffic moving through a compromised voicemail computer in Rolling Meadows, Illinois, the operation had already grown to a scale nobody had anticipated. Secret Service agents were monitoring the system, cataloging the access codes being traded, building a picture of what they were actually dealing with. And everywhere they looked, they kept finding the same thing: a name, a voice, a presence that moved through every compromised system they examined like a signature. Sometimes she identified herself as Kyrie, sometimes as long-distance information, but she was always there, at the center of the traffic, coordinating the distribution, connecting the people who wanted codes with the systems that held them. Agents contacted operators of compromised voicemail computers in other states, Indiana, Ohio, further out. The same codes, the same patterns, the same name. What they were building a picture of was not a local fraud, not a small-time operation. It was a nationwide network running through systems in multiple states with 152 participants across the country feeding into it. And some of those participants, when investigators eventually identified them, were teenagers. There was only one question left, and it was the one that mattered most. Who was she? The answer didn't come from a wiretap. It didn't come from a surveillance operation or an informant inside the network. It came from Canada. In early March 1989, MCI security officials in Chicago made contact with the Secret Service agents running the investigation. They had information passed along from Canadian Bell Security, and that information cracked the case open. Canadian Bell knew the alias. They knew Kyrie, and they had a real name to go with it. Leslie Lynne Doucette, Canadian citizen, currently residing in Chicago, Illinois. Investigators pulled the Canadian records. What they found there added a dimension to the case that nobody had fully expected. On March 12, 1987, 2 full years before, American federal agents had connected a single dot. 2 years before anyone in the United States had formally identified this network or the person running it, Leslie Lynne Doucette had already been convicted of telecommunications theft in Canada. She had been sentenced to 90 days in custody and 2 years of probation. She had served her time, crossed the border, and built something 10 times larger on the other side of it. On May 24, 1989, federal agents moved on her apartment on North Ashland Avenue in Chicago. The raid turned up exactly what the investigation had suggested would be there: 168 telephone credit card numbers, 39 PBX extender codes, all of them unauthorized, all of them stolen, all of them documented and cataloged and ready to be traded. She was arrested on the spot and held without bond at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago. No bail. The federal system had decided she was a flight risk, and given that she had already crossed one international border after one conviction, the reasoning was not difficult to follow. The federal grand jury indictment came down on June 21, 1989. The Chicago Tribune ran it the same day, and when the numbers became public, they landed hard. Stolen passwords used to obtain $38,000 worth of voicemail service. Fraudulent calling card numbers generating over $286,000 in stolen calls. And the PBX figure, $1,291,000 in long-distance telephone service, billed to companies that never knew their systems had been compromised. Total documented losses across the scheme, more than $1.6 million, and it had been running for years. When Leslie Lynne Doucette pleaded guilty, she admitted in open court to trafficking stolen access codes to 152 hackers across the United States. The documented federal fraud losses attached to the specific counts of her plea came to nearly $600,000, with the broader losses from the full operation extending well beyond that figure. On August 17, 1990, she stood before Judge Milton I Shadur of the United States District Court in Chicago. She was 36 years old. The sentence handed down was 27 months in federal prison. At the time, it was one of the harshest sentences ever imposed on a computer hacker in United States history. The courtroom that day was the end of one chapter and the beginning of something much larger, because the legal system in 1989 was not built for what Leslie Lynne Doucette had done. Prosecutors had been making decisions on the fly throughout the entire investigation, interpreting the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 in real time, arguing for the first time in federal court that hacker voicemail traffic inadvertently obtained by a compromised system could be legally disclosed to federal agents. These were not settled questions of law. They were being established from scratch, in this case, because this case demanded it. The United States Department of Justice later published a formal written analysis of the entire prosecution. The document was titled Costly Callers: Prosecuting Voice Mail Fraud. In it, the Doucette case was identified explicitly as the first federal prosecution ever brought against the abuse of voicemail computers in American history. And as a direct consequence of this case, case, the law changed. People convicted of computer-related crimes became subject to federally mandated prison terms, and restitution orders scaled to the size of the fraud. The legal framework for prosecuting cybercrime in the United States was rebuilt case by case, starting here. More than 3 decades have passed since Kyrie stood before a federal judge in Chicago. The technology she exploited is long gone. Voicemail computers of that era are museum pieces. The telephone infrastructure she moved through has been replaced and replaced again. The world she operated in barely resembles the one that exists today. And yet the thing she understood, the core insight that made all of it possible, has never stopped being true. She didn't find a bug in a piece of software. She didn't exploit a flaw that an engineer had carelessly left in the code. What she found was something older and harder to fix than any technical vulnerability. She found the gap between what a system was designed to do and what it could actually be made to do by someone patient enough to understand it completely. She found the trust, the unexamined, unquestioned, deeply expensive trust that corporations extend to their own infrastructure. The belief that because something is locked, it cannot be opened. That because a password exists, it will hold. That because a system is trusted, it is safe. That belief is exactly as dangerous today as it was in 1988. Every major corporate breach you have read about in the last decade begins somewhere in that same gap. Stolen credentials used by people who were never supposed to have them. Systems behaving exactly as they were designed to behave for the wrong people. Fraud moving through legitimate infrastructure at volume, invisible against the noise of 10,000 legitimate transactions happening alongside it, until someone looks closely enough to see what doesn't belong. Leslie Lynne Doucette figured all of that out with a telephone, a network of teenagers, and a system that an entire industry had staked its reputation on. She didn't break it. She understood it better than the people who built it. And in the underground, in the voicemail boxes of corporations that never knew her name, in the messages left and retrieved and traded across a country that had no idea any of it was happening. For a long time, that understanding was the most valuable thing she owned.